I need to share something that might change my entire family's life, Oliver declared, lifting his glass with an air of self-assurance. Right away, every face at his housewarming celebration turned toward him. There was a spark in his eyes. I knew all too well, he loved being the center of attention. To grand adventures, to new addresses, he continued, his voice growing dramatic. Then he paused, letting a hush settle over the living room. And, he added softly, to Granddad's memory. That last statement made the mood shift suddenly. Our grandfather had passed just 4 days prior, and the loss was fresh in every heart here tonight. With a gentle swallow, I, Amy, raised my own glass alongside the others, honoring the man who'd been an anchor in my world. Over on the couch, my cousin Ivy lightly dabbed the corner of her eye, clearly still coming to terms with our sudden family heartbreak. Oliver set his drink down on a gleaming side table in the newly furnished house. Actually, he said, clearing his throat, Granddad's legacy runs deeper than we thought. Before his passing, he left me a letter, and I think it's time I share it with all of you. At those words, my stomach tightened. Something in my brother's expression warned me that he was up to more than just a heartfelt tribute. Growing up, Oliver always had a knack for making scenes revolve around him. Tonight, though, this looked different. More deliberate, maybe. And for some reason, the way he glanced in my direction made me uneasy. I tried to mask my apprehension with a polite sip of champagne as Oliver reached into his back pocket and revealed a slightly crumpled envelope. It's about Granddad's place, Oliver proclaimed, letting the tension build. The cabin by the lake. He might as well have detonated a tiny bomb in the middle of the living room. Our father leaned forward, eyes alert with curiosity. Mom set her glass down as though she expected huge news. Marissa, Oliver's girlfriend, squeezed his shoulder and beamed with pride, convinced whatever he was about to share would only raise his star. Meanwhile, Ivy and I traded quick glances. Our father's voice cut through the hush. Well, son, go on. Oliver exhaled, then tapped the crisp corner of his letter. Granddad wanted me to have the cabin, he said, his tone dropping a fraction of an octave. He spelled it all out right here. Ivy arched an eyebrow my way, her confusion mirroring my own. We both knew how much Granddad's cabin meant to me. Every last tree, every inch of the shoreline under that summer sun. I'd been there nearly every spare weekend for 3 years, painting the porch, cleaning the gutters, listening to Granddad's recollections about life and family. In comparison, Oliver hardly ever showed up, and on the rare occasions he did, he whined about non-existent cell reception. Yet here he was, boldly claiming Granddad had left it to him. I gripped my glass stem so hard I was afraid it might crack. My thoughts roamed back 3 weeks ago, when Granddad had pressed a small wooden box into my hands, telling me in that quivering voice of his, Amy, promise you won't open this until you really need to. I'd stashed it on the top shelf of a bedroom closet, suspecting it was something important, but never imagining it would relate to ownership of the lake property. But if Oliver was telling the truth, then what was in Granddad's wooden box? He read from his letter as though it were a solemn speech. I, Richard Donovan, being of sound mind and body. That was Granddad's name, but I couldn't see the text well enough to confirm if it was in his handwriting. The scrawl looked too neat. Granddad's arthritis made his writing shaky toward the final weeks. As Oliver stood there, chest puffed out like he'd just inherited a kingdom, I felt my heart racing with suspicion. I forced a tight smile, hoping to hide my turmoil. That's some news, Olish, I managed, using the nickname I used for him growing up. Congratulations. He grinned, though the edge in his eyes told me he was gauging my reaction. Meanwhile, the others congratulated him, or clinked glasses with half-hearted cheer. Mom even murmured something about how proud Granddad would be that Oliver was continuing the family tradition of, actually nobody was sure what tradition that might be, since Oliver had never shown an ounce of interest in that lakeside property. I whispered to Ivy, something's off, gotta step away. She nodded almost imperceptibly, understanding my need to regroup. Slipping past the oblivious well-wishers, I ducked into a hallway that led to a guest bathroom. Behind the locked bathroom door, I leaned against the cool wooden panel and closed my eyes, trying to catch my breath. Could Oliver's new letter override the instructions Granddad had quietly given me? Or worse, could Granddad have changed his mind, leaving me out of the loop entirely? My phone buzzed. A text from Ivy. This is beyond weird, she wrote. Oliver never cared about that cabin, like at all. I quickly typed back. I know, let me handle this. I'm going home in a few. Cover for me, she replied with a thumbs-up emoji. And within minutes, I heard her telling some family members that I'd been called in to help at the clinic where I worked. It was a convenient excuse, and no one questioned it, given that my phone sometimes blew up with urgent requests. My quietly urgent escape led me out to the side gate, the muffled music still pulsing behind me. Once I got into my car, the enormity of the situation sank in. Granddad had given me that old wooden box, telling me not to look inside unless the moment was right. Even with this bizarre turn of events, I wasn't entirely certain whether that moment had arrived, but something deep in my gut screamed that I needed answers now. Headlights flickered in my rearview mirror as I pulled out of Oliver's driveway. With lead-foot determination, I zoomed across Somerton's dimly lit streets, the hush of midnight blanketing everything, my mind filled with images of my grandfather, the twinkle in his gaze when we hammered new steps on his rickety porch, the way he'd point out constellations over the lake at night, as if unveiling priceless secrets just for me, and how he'd pat the nearby chair while sipping warm cocoa, inviting me to sit and tell him about my day. Even before I turned the knob to my apartment, I was already heading for my closet. Beneath a stack of blankets sat the humble wooden box my grandfather had entrusted to me. It wasn't locked, but a simple metal clasp held it shut like a guardian of hidden truths. Curiosity and a swirl of anxiety churned inside me. Could it hold a conflicting proof I was the rightful new caretaker of the lakefront property? Or might it hold some other relic altogether, removing any illusions on my part? With a shaky breath, I sat cross-legged on the carpet, gingerly opened the worn lid and peered inside. Inside, I found 2 neatly folded documents and a sealed envelope with my name scribbled in Granddad's unmistakable scrawl. A tiny brass key also sat at the bottom of the box, glinting under my overhead lamp. My chest fluttered with a mix of excitement and dread. Before I lost my nerve, I spread the papers out on the floor and flipped the first page over. I almost stopped breathing. The heading read, Deed Transfer of Ownership, and there was Granddad's signature alongside the official notarization stamp. Dated 6 months prior, it spelled out precisely that the beloved lake cabin was mine, already registered outside of his future estate. My eyes skimmed every line, each word confirming Granddad's intention to make me the property's rightful owner. But in the hush of that late-night moment, my relief was tangled with confusion. Oliver had just claimed Granddad left the same property to him. One of us had false information, or someone was lying. Slowly I turned to the second paper, a note in Granddad's shaky handwriting, paragraphs slanting across the page. My dearest Amy, it began, I've placed the cabin in your name while I'm still able. You've shown it true devotion. I paused for a moment to wipe away tears. Beyond the official tone, I heard Granddad's gentle warmth in every syllable, the fatherly advice he'd given me on those breezy afternoons, the easy laughter we shared when we hammered nails into the old porch. Reading further, I learned he'd arranged everything to be airtight under the law, specifically to avoid complications. One line stood out. I have told Harold Thompson, my attorney, to keep this deed separate from the will. My breath caught as I read. Your brother has never loved that cabin as you do. Should he protest, the documentation is ironclad, filed and sealed. The swirl of heartbreak and vindication in my chest was overwhelming. Even from beyond the grave, Granddad was protecting my bond with that special place. Setting the letter down, I steadied myself with a deep breath. Then I lifted the smaller envelope addressed to me. My fingers shook as I slid a thumb under the flap and eased out a handwritten message. Amy, it read, use this key to open the antique roll-top desk in the cabin study. I've left you a few keepsakes, and maybe a surprise or two. Remember, no matter what storms arise, the cabin stands for peace. Yours always, Granddad. I clutched the key so tightly it left an imprint on my palm. A swirl of memories flooded my mind. Nights we spent charting constellations, early mornings fishing as fog clung to the water, and the creak of that old desk where I'd once found a stash of Granddad's postcards from world travels he took long before I was born. Now I held proof the cabin was legally mine, and a note that might spark a war with Oliver if he insisted on his claim. A faint, tired anger rose in me at the thought of my brother brandishing a letter that contradicted all this. Granddad could never have written 2 conflicting instructions. So was Oliver's letter a forgery? The possibility punched me in the gut, yet a tiny voice inside reminded me that perhaps Oliver was only repeating a misunderstanding. But I couldn't forget that he'd barely set foot in that cabin for years, perpetually complaining about the middle-of-nowhere vibe. My phone vibrated again. This time it was Dad, asking why I'd made such a quick exit from Oliver's party. I let it ring. I wasn't ready to explain. Instead, I carefully refolded the deed and letters, then slid them back into the wooden box, making sure every corner was protected. Even if I was furious at Oliver's announcement, I had to keep my cool for one reason. I owed it to Granddad's memory to handle this with dignity. Nobody could predict the fallout that might come next. If Oliver stuck to his guns, there'd likely be a messy confrontation. Our parents would demand answers, and the entire extended family might get pulled into the vortex. Yet Granddad's letter told me exactly what I had to do. Keep my spirit in that cabin, he'd written, and show mercy when you can. Even though it was midnight, I couldn't sleep. Mind racing, I brewed a pot of tea, paced the living room, and wrestled with a single question. Should I confront Oliver now, or wait until everything was calmer? The 2 documents in my possession were about to shatter his proud claim. Either he'd step back peacefully, or this would get ugly. At last I decided. I scooped up the wooden box, secured it in a zippered tote bag, and set my car keys on the counter so I wouldn't change my mind. The only way forward was to return to Oliver's house and talk to him face to face. Tomorrow, I promised myself. Tomorrow, I show him the truth. Morning came all too soon, and my stomach rumbled with the uneasy realization of what lay ahead. I barely touched my cereal.
rehearsing again and again how I'd confront Oliver and present the deed that nullified his little performance. After tossing out the uneaten food, I grabbed Granddad's wooden box, tightened my jacket around me, and headed to Oliver's neighborhood. The drive took me past a quiet stretch of shops where dawn's early light made the windows gleam. Even though it was still early, my pulse whipped at me, part fear, part anticipation. If Oliver kept pushing his false claim, the confrontation would be harsh, yet a small voice in my head kept urging me to handle it calmly, for Granddad's sake. When I reached Oliver's place, I noticed the decorations in the front window were still up from last night's party. Balloons tied to a chair on the porch, a tossed-out banner limp over a potted plant. It was a reminder of how quickly celebrations can turn sour. At first, I considered knocking. Then I caught a glimpse of Oliver himself through the glass door, looking restless in the living room. My heart thudded. If I hesitated too long, I'd talk myself out of doing this. So I simply walked up, rapped on the door, and waited. Oliver opened it with a half-startled expression, like he couldn't decide if he was happy or furious to see me. "Amy," he said flatly. He pushed back a messy strand of hair, then stepped aside. "I guess you got my message last night." "Message?" I asked. He let out a short laugh. "I texted you, thought we should talk about the cabin. I'm sure you've heard by now that it belongs to me." He paused, a hint of uncertainty flickering across his features. "Well, according to Granddad's letter," I followed him inside, noticing the remnants of the night's festivities scattered around. Empty cups, half-eaten snacks, a glittery congratulations sign now drooping off the kitchen counter. The house felt oddly hollow. Oliver offered me a seat, but I declined, choosing to stay standing, the wooden box clutched under my arm. "You want to bring Mom and Dad in? Might as well settle everything at once," I said, trying to stay level. I spotted our parents in the adjacent room, rummaging through old photo frames. They must have slept over, or maybe came by first thing in the morning to help tidy up. Our mother blinked in surprise. "Amy, I didn't realize you'd be here so soon." Without missing a beat, Oliver motioned to them. "We all might need to have a little family talk." Nobody spoke as we gathered in the living room. I took a quick look around. Mom perched stiffly on the couch, Dad leaning against a wall with his arms folded, and Oliver pacing a few steps near the window. The tension felt thick enough to slice through. Finally, Oliver cleared his throat. "I know I dropped a bomb last night," he said, hauling out the envelope he'd flaunted earlier, "but I figured we should get everything in the open." I nodded. "That's exactly why I'm here." Carefully, I slid Granddad's wooden box onto Oliver's coffee table. It wobbled slightly on the surface, and my nerves jumped. "Granddad left me something too," I said. "Some documents he specifically told me to keep private until the moment was right." Our mother's hand flew to her mouth, and Dad straightened as though anticipating a knockout punch.
As Oliver lifted his chin in defiance, I didn't bother grooming my words. "The cabin's already mine," I announced, pulling out the notarized deed. "Granddad transferred it 6 months ago, before he passed." Oliver blinked, the color draining from his face. That's not possible," he whispered, turning toward his neatly folded letter. Calmly, I held out Granddad's note. "It's all spelled out here in his handwriting. You can even see the arthritis in the script. It's definitely not forged." "Dad, maybe you should take a look." Dad stepped forward, adjusting his reading glasses. His eyes roamed across every line, and with each second that ticked by, I felt my heart pound harder. Mom hovered at his shoulder, glancing between the paper and Oliver's face. Finally, Dad spoke in a hushed tone. "This is a sworn deed, registered and notarized. No question about its authenticity." Oliver's mouth twitched. He opened and closed it wordlessly, as if he couldn't form a coherent defense. Then, in a spasm of defiance, he stuck Granddad's so-called letter right next to the one from my box, letting everyone see the contrast. The difference in handwriting was painfully obvious. His letter boasted neat, steady lines, whereas Granddad's real penmanship bore the slight shakiness of advancing age. A vein in Dad's forehead pulsed. "Oliver," he said softly, "explain yourself." Not a peep came from Oliver. Mom placed a hand on his shoulder, but he shrugged it away. "Why can't you see I'm just trying to preserve what's mine?" he hissed, though the words sounded hollow. "You never even cared about that cabin," I cut in, unable to hold back. "Why pretend you do now?" Oliver shot me a tortured look. "I loved Granddad too," he muttered, voice unsteady. "He never really gave me the time you had. It isn't fair." Dad frowned. "So you made up a letter to stake your claim?" Oliver's eyes darted to the floor. Meanwhile, Mom sank onto the couch, pressing her forehead with trembling fingers, as though nursing the beginnings of a headache. Nothing moved except the slow tick of the clock on the mantel. I exhaled. "Listen," I said, "there's more to this than some inheritance. Granddad wanted—" "That's enough," Oliver murmured, cutting me off. His face was unreadable. He stared at the mismatched letters for a long, tense moment, then slowly crumpled the forged page in his fist. Cliffhanger. Oliver let the forgery fall to the floor, a crumpled ball of paper bearing all his guilt. For a few seconds, no one spoke. My heart thumped inside my chest, and a part of me dreaded what might happen next. Dad set the real deed on the table and pressed both palms against it, like he was steadying himself. Meanwhile, our mother opened and closed her mouth several times, visibly searching for words that refused to come. Finally, comma. Oliver mumbled, "I guess I messed this up beyond repair." He directed the comment at the space near his feet, avoiding everyone's eyes. Mom slowly rose from the couch. She brushed imaginary dust off her skirt, trying to collect herself. "Oliver," she began softly, "why did you think forging that letter would solve anything? Did you think no one would notice?" He stayed silent, as though hoping the question might vanish on its own. Then, in a torn voice, he tried to explain. "I was jealous. Granddad loved Amy more. Or maybe that's not true. It just felt like that." In the hush that followed, I found myself studying Oliver's face, his frown, the tense set of his jaw. We'd grown up squabbling, but this was a chasm so deep, I wondered if we would ever truly climb out. Dad ran a hand through his thinning hair. He shook his head, exhaling as though he'd aged years overnight. "We can't change the past," he said, "but this," he gestured at the forged letter on the floor. "You crossed a line, son." Fear glimmered in Oliver's eyes. Maybe he was worried Dad would cut him out of the family altogether. Mom touched Dad's arm gently, and the two exchanged one of those wordless looks only longtime spouses understand. I cleared my throat. "Listen, Granddad planned for you too," I said carefully. "It's not like he shut you out of everything. His note to me said the cabin was the right fit for someone who loved it, but it doesn't mean he didn't love you." Mom nodded, stepping forward until she was an arm's length from Oliver. Her voice cracked. "You have to realize we're not angry because you wanted the cabin. We're angry because you tried to take it in a dishonest way. You tried to trick us." As if weighed down by heavy chains, Oliver lowered himself into the nearest chair. "I didn't know how else to get Dad's approval, or anyone's approval, really," he confessed. Dad sighed. "This family doesn't thrive on lies, Oliver. I would have listened." Oliver cut in bitterly. "Would you? You've always had a soft spot for Amy because she followed Granddad's passions. She was the one teaching him how to use that new phone, driving up to fix the porch, taking him groceries when the roads were icy." His words rushed out like water through a burst dam. "Meanwhile, I was off doing my own thing, and at some point, it just felt like I wasn't needed." Something about that confession tugged at me. Had Oliver, my older brother, truly felt like a spare piece in our family puzzle? I thought back to every rebuffed invitation, every time I'd called him from the cabin to say, "Hey, you want to join us for the weekend?" And he'd always turned me down. Granddad never stopped reaching out. I whispered at last. "You chose not to respond. But he knew you had different interests, and he didn't hold that against you. Maybe you held it against yourself." Oliver frowned, absorbing the words. A ragged minute passed before he spoke again. "I really did blow it. Not just the letter, but all those times I could have come to the lake and didn't. Part of me wanted to feel triumphant. After all, he had tried to break my trust in the most painful way, but I also understood the heavy weight of regret. With Granddad gone, we'd never have a chance to mend that lost time." Dad turned toward me. "Amy, you have the rightful deed." He paused, sincerity in his gaze. "Do you plan to keep it? Or," I breathed in slowly, letting the question settle. "It's staying in my name, just like Granddad wanted." That was non-negotiable. But I'm not going to shut Oliver out if he ever wants to visit. The cabin is still part of this family. That's the spirit of what Granddad wanted, right? Oliver studied his hands. He had a fleeting look of relief, though uncertainty still clouded his face. "I wouldn't blame you if you never let me within a mile of it," he said, half joking and half sorrowful. Mom stepped over and put a tentative hand on his shoulder. "Maybe you two need time," she suggested, glancing at me for confirmation. I nodded. My anger at Oliver's betrayal was still there, a sharp sting under the surface. But Granddad's letter had asked me to show mercy when I could. I wondered if it was possible to forgive Oliver while still keeping a safe distance, at least for a while. An uneven silence blanketed the room. Then, slowly, Dad pivoted to me. "So," he asked, "are you heading up to the cabin soon?" A part of me longed to climb in my car right now and escape to that lakeside retreat, away from the tense energy swirling in here. "Yes," I answered, though I softened my tone. "I want to go see if everything's in decent shape after Granddad's passing. It's been a few weeks since I visited." Oliver cleared his throat. Would you mind if I came along?" The question surprised me. I expected him to run from the awkwardness of last night's fiasco, maybe bury himself in another scheme. "Why would you want to?" I asked gently, still reeling from everything. He opened his mouth but no words came. Eventually, he shrugged. "Maybe because it's never too late to learn what Granddad found so special about that place." Dad and Mom exchanged glances, clearly uncertain whether this was a genuine step toward reconciliation or another attempt at control. My pulse beat faster. Could I trust him enough to let him see the cabin in this raw moment? Uncertain, I turned my gaze to the wooden box on the table. Images of Granddad danced in my mind. His lined face, the subtle humor in his eyes whenever Oliver and I bickered. He had always believed in redemption. "All right," I said finally, surprising even myself. "I'll be driving up tomorrow. If you mean it, and you can respect the property, come meet me there later in the day." Oliver nodded, his face solemn. "Thank you." Dad went to grab some trash bags, muttering that we might as well tidy up last night's wreckage before heading anywhere else. Mom drifted after him, leaving Oliver and me in a strained hush. Somewhere in that hush, I felt a strange flicker of hope. If Oliver was telling the truth, if he genuinely wanted to understand Granddad's beloved cabin, maybe something good could come out of all this. Even so, a voice inside me whispered to stay cautious. Oliver's track record was far from spotless, and I couldn't be sure how he'd handle the realization that he couldn't override the deed. My hand went to the documents resting on the table. They were safe, they were legitimate, and if Oliver tried any new deception, at least I knew where I stood. Before I left, we all gave each other stilted hugs or handshakes. It wasn't exactly a warm farewell, but we were no longer on the brink of shouting. As I stepped through Oliver's front door, the daylight felt almost too bright for the mood we shared. Once again, I quietly reminded myself, "Don't let your guard down yet." With the wooden box tucked securely under my arm, I climbed into my car and drove away, the cabin's front porch already vivid in my imagination. I resolved to head up there first thing in the morning, to breathe in the crisp, lake-scented air that was Granddad's legacy, and to be ready for whatever came next. Cliffhanger. Morning arrived with a golden glow that spread across the skyline as I navigated the winding roads toward the lake. The familiar sense of pine and morning dew drifted in through my open window, instantly soothing the knots in my stomach. With each bend in the road, I felt a long-standing peace returning, like I was finally crossing a threshold into the realm Granddad and I had shared for so many years. When I reached the driveway, gravel crunched under my tires, and sunlight captured dust motes dancing in the air. The cabin stood exactly as I remembered. Sun-bleached logs, emerald shutters, and a wraparound porch that had seen countless family stories unfold. I grabbed my coat and the wooden box, then stepped onto the porch, noticing a few cobwebs clinging to the rafters. This place had been quiet too long. Inside, the musty aroma of unoccupied space greeted me, mingled with the faint trace of pipe tobacco. Granddad could never fully give up. My eyes roamed over the living room's braided rugs, the stone fireplace with a crooked mantel, and the row of fishing poles propped tall against the wall. Memories of Granddad teaching me to tie a hook and reel in the line on lazy afternoons drifted through my mind like incredibly vivid ghosts. I set the wooden box on the coffee table, rummaging inside for the brass key Granddad had mentioned. It felt surreal, unlocking the old roll-top desk in the study alone. Sunlight filtered in through a small window, illuminating floating specks of dust. The desk gave a slight creak as I rolled it open, revealing a row of envelopes, labeled in Granddad's deliberate scrawl. Most were marked with short titles: boat repairs, summer harvest recipes, even jokes to tell Amy when she's sad. Tears stung my eyes at that one. Scanning through each, I found references to Grandpa's hidden stash of postcards, typed letters from old friends, and random sketches of the lakeshore. The sense of familiarity and belonging was stronger than ever. In a corner compartment, I discovered an envelope labeled "For Oliver," sealed with a piece of tape. My heart skipped. Another letter for Oliver. I hesitated, longing to open it and discover its contents, but Granddad's instructions about boundaries echoed in my thoughts. Curling my fingers around the envelope, I felt unsettled. If Oliver came around as he promised, I'd have to decide whether to hand it over or read it first to protect myself. After all, he'd recently tried to forge Granddad's name, yet a tiny spark of hope nudged me to trust Granddad's design. Maybe this letter was meant to guide Oliver in a better direction. I closed the desk with a bittersweet sigh, then carried the envelope into the kitchen and left it on the counter. The rest of the morning drifted by in quiet tasks, opening windows to release the stale air, hunting down fresh linens in the storage closet, and cleaning a small layer of dust off framed family photos. At one point, I caught sight of a snapshot with Granddad, Oliver, and me, all beaming wide smiles on a rickety canoe. Oliver was about 8 or 9 in that photo, and his grin looked genuine. What happened to make us drift apart? As midday approached, I perched on the porch swing, letting it sway gently. Sunlight sparkled off the lake, filling me with calm. I slipped off my shoes to rest my bare feet on the porch railing, letting the warmth of the day soak in. No matter how much tension carried over from the city, this spot always seemed to melt it away. My phone vibrated on the seat next to me. A text from Oliver. "Leaving soon. Be there in an hour." My stomach tensed. Was I really prepared to face him again so soon, after his betrayal and forced admission? I reread the text, trying to gauge whether there was genuine remorse in those few words. It was impossible to tell, but I couldn't ignore Granddad's last instructions, to offer mercy whenever possible. Oliver had messed up deeply, but if there was a chance for redemption, maybe it would start here.
I glanced at the small wooden box resting near the door, its contents a mix of comfort and heartache. In just a short time, Oliver would be standing on this porch, trying to reconcile with the reality he'd sought to steal from me. Could we find any common ground after what he pulled? I wasn't sure. A quiver of nervousness flipped in my stomach. Finally, I forced myself up from the swing and took a slow walk around the perimeter of the cabin, noticing small tasks that needed attention. A loose gutter here, a missing shutter latch there. Each chore reminded me of Granddad's steady work ethic. Fix what's broken, don't leave it to get worse. Maybe that lesson applied as much to relationships as it did to gutters.
When I returned to my seat, I spotted dust trailing in the distance, a car rounding the corner toward our gravel lot. My pulse caught. Oliver's arrival was no longer an abstract promise. In moments he'd be here, stepping out onto the driveway with expectations I couldn't fully predict. I closed my eyes, inhaled the tang of pine and lake water, and braced myself for the confrontation that was about to happen. Pliver sini tenna, cliffhanger do fible brishy des.